University. And I'm really happy that this roundtable has finally come to fruition. This was a plan that was hatched by 3 centers here at IU. My center, the Center Inter-Asia and Uralic Studies Center, and Russia and East Europe Studies Center as well. We're all 3 of us are Title VI National Resource Centers. And so I want to give a shout out to the U.S. Department of Education for their support of our event as well. I am going to turn over in just a moment the introduction of the actual panel to my colleague, Professor Round in Central Eurasian Studies. But before I do that, I just want to say I am personally really excited about this because I've been doing work on Islam in China for a number of years. And I also want to put a plug in, keep your eyes open for a special issue in the journal Sociology of Islam. It's going to have a whole bunch of papers that focus on halal practices in non-Islamic states. And one of the panelists, Aisalkyn, and myself worked, and we're going to be part of that special issue. And hopefully that special issue will come out within a year. Okay, enough said, but I think this is a highly relevant topic to what's going on around the world right now. As most of us should know, if we don't, Muslims are probably the fastest growing group of people around the world. I'm thinking of this from a group of consumers, but this goes beyond just consumption. So this is a panel that I think has a really timely and important topic that we're looking at. And one of the things that I really like about this panel and the speakers is that we're going to get a pretty wide view of Islamic economies across Eurasia. So with that having been said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Toivo to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I am also very pleased to be part of this event, and I am the director of the Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center. And it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Aisalkyn Botoeva. She is currently a research, evaluation, and learning specialist at Search for Common Ground, as well as a visiting fellow at George Washington University. She holds a BA from American University of Central Asia, an MA from Central European University, at the time located in Budapest, and she has a PhD in sociology from Brown University in 2017. She is the author of an extensive range of publications on economic development in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia. And before I turn the floor over to her, let me note how we will be handling questions today. What we ask you to do is to use the chat function and simply indicate your desire to pose a question by writing the word question, not the question itself. And Sarah Phillips will keep track of things and recognize speakers, recognize questioners as they present themselves. And you can pose your question. You can pose the desire to pose a question anytime during the event. You don't have to wait until everyone is finished. Without that having been said, let me turn the floor over to Dr. Botoeva, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. Let me quickly, before I jump in, share my screen because my slides are there. Can everybody see my screen now? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, can we see them well? Okay, great. Well, I will begin. Yep, perfect. Thank you. Thank you again for all of the organizers. I'm very excited to be a part of this workshop. I know we all wanted to gather in person back in March, and that would have been ideal, but we are doing the best what we can, I guess, right? And thank you again for all of the organizers and everyone who is here today. I'm honored to be part of this panel and to present alongside colleagues on the panel today. So my name is Aisalkyn Botoeva. I am a visiting fellow at the George Washington University, but I also, my full-time position currently is with Search for Common Ground. Today, my talk is titled Halal Inequality, Discourses and Practices of the Islamic Economy in Central Asia. So I will be reading from my notes just to sort of make sure that I'm on time, and hopefully that will work out fine. So some of you may have come across reports such as these. They are from the Dinar Standard organization, one of the organizations that keeps track of or attempts, right, to monitor what is the kind of spending within the global Islamic economy. So here you have a very sort of, it's kind of just an illustration, right, of what they have estimated to be, to have been the global spending in the Islamic economy, and that it totaled in 2018 to 2.2 trillion US dollars, right, across different sectors, including halal food, modest fashion, media and recreation, Muslim-friendly travel, and so forth. And usually they also add projections, right, for what they think will be the kind of global spending in these sectors, you know, in the future. So here they show the estimate for the 2024. So when it comes to Central Asia, right, the focus of my study, and within Central Asia, particularly it's Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, it was only starting from early to mid 2000s, right, that the Central Asian states of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, two sites of my research have joined this, so to say, worldwide trend. When I did my field work between 2012 and 2015, there was already a wide range of businesses that were identified in various ways, right, as Islamic, Sharia compliant, halal, or adal and Kyrgyz. And these businesses really ranged from large banks to microfinance and insurance companies, from Muslim daycares and halal food producers to wholesale and retail traders of goods targeted at the pious population, but also, you know, broadly, right, whoever would, you know, feel inclined, right, to partake in these sectors. So scholars have variously treated this term to sort of the Islamic economy, right, banks and various halal markets in different ways. Some have viewed these trends as sort of a thin facade, right, to otherwise capitalist motives of market actors, while others really saw the same landscape kind of as a product of really bottom-up initiatives and religious movements seeking to counteract what they would perceive to be a moral or unacceptable kind of business practices. So in my approach, and I can talk more about it, what I'm presenting today is really, this is the first time when I'm presenting the way in which I'm trying to reframe my doctoral dissertation research. And Patricia and Morgan, I see, is here today too, are some of the people who have been helping me along the way and have commented on my previous drafts. So I'm happy to sort of share my project in the way in which I've been trying to sort of reframe it, right? So in my study, I build on the existing studies of Islam and capitalism globally, but also pay attention to sort of this trend of research that focuses specifically on Muslim practices in Central Asia and the broader Eurasia. But then my focus is really sort of in trying to investigate what has been understudied, particularly in the region that I'm focusing on. In particular, it's this class-based dynamic, right? Or how the political elite, the middle classes, And the dispossessed also, how do they contest, right, Islam, and how do they espouse its different sort of articulations in the market? So when it comes to research questions, these are sort of the broader research questions that I try to address in my project. Namely, how do political leaders and Muslim entrepreneurs who occupy diverse socioeconomic positions draw on Islam, and how do they sort of draw on the discourse, right, and the kind of knowledge that they actually can access to explain the connection between piety, but also profit-making activities, and also growing inequalities. How do these diverse political and market actors espouse divergent orientations, right, and devise strategies to engage in local economies? And if Islam, we say, promises the tools to build, right, an alternative capitalism or an alternative future, how do these market actors understand these pathways, utilize these means, and to what kind of ends? So those are the broad kind of research questions in my study. To address these questions in my dissertation, I drew on a multi-sided ethnographic approach, including interviews, secondary sources, and participant observations in 4 cities. In Kyrgyzstan, it's Bishkek and Osh, and in Kazakhstan, Astana and Almaty. In the study, I was interested in how Islam may provide these kind of new repertoires, right, of contention to social groups that align or clash along ethno-national, spiritual, but more importantly, these class lines. This is just a quick graphic to show at the time, these were the official numbers for businesses that were registered as halal compliant in the 2 countries. So my focus, again, I looked at a wide range of sites within the economy, from higher visibility finance to medium and small private businesses, right, as well as bazaars and kind of the smaller, really micro entrepreneurs, where these, the owners and the managers of these businesses explicitly or implicitly identify their businesses as Islamic, adal, or halal. And my focus was also sort of on the everyday practices, right, that entrepreneurs engage in, and the kind of spaces where they interact with street level bureaucrats or mid-rank government officials, their clientele, mosque leaders, or the their secularist critics. Without a further ado, given the time limitation, I will jump into the kind of the findings and the analysis, and I'm happy to expand more in the Q&A session. One of the groups that I'm focusing on, right, is the political elite and the so-called Muslim bourgeois. The political elite here is usually, right, is represented by the government authorities, be it from the sort of the old guard, but also the self-made kind of politicians that we have represented in both countries. So the political elite, as well as practitioners of Islamic finance and the advocates of Islamic finance in both countries, and especially in metropoles, right, have drawn from Islam to explain their standing, but also their power as kind of worthy, right, and seek to generate wealth in ways that attract less scrutiny from the masses. 2 large Islamic banks in both countries, Al Hilal in Kazakhstan, but then also Eco-Islamic in Kyrgyzstan, they were established in large part because they were able to garner support from the government officials and the political elite. Both governments of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are known for their tactics, and I'm sure some of our presenters and also participants in the panel know this. They're known for their tactics of oppression when it comes to sort of unorthodox, right, Islamic movements. The political elite really monopolizes those kinds of platforms through which they project, right, their own distinctive brand of Kazakh or Kyrgyz Muslimness, especially when it comes to the international arena. That in turn helps them to cultivate ties than with foreign investors based in the Gulf, that they have successfully, in some cases, as in the case of large Islamic banks, right? They have successfully been able to sort of use and utilize those kinds of connections that they have access to. So in light of this, what Hanini calls the pious bourgeois, right, bourgeoisie, or those Muslims who are connected to the political elite, they enjoy really this kind of privileged status, right? In other words, the upper niche of the Muslim entrepreneurs, they make their profits from catering to the demands of the growing pious urban bourgeois values and aesthetics, and invest their money in what they themselves call modern and progressive schools, but also mosques and developmental projects that are meant to sort of cultivate this, again, what they see and perceive as civil and progressive forms of Islam. Here, I just wanted to quickly show two quick quotes. From one is from the President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, and another from then, at the time, Omurbek Babanov, the Vice Prime Minister in Kyrgyzstan. Both are focusing here, right, sort of on how Islamic finance can sort of be really, right, pave the way to being not just in financial independent, but also they really see this as a or at least they frame it, right, in their rhetoric as a source of alternative kinds of economic means and economic development. So because the focus here is so much on Islamic finance, building connections to donors and business partners in other Muslim countries, questions, you know, the kinds of questions of justice, if we basically look at the kind of discourse, right, among the political elite and the Muslim bourgeois, you know, the questions of justice are really sort of are at the margins, right? And usually they kind of are relegated to charities that again, in this rhetoric, is charities are basically the means through which we can alleviate, right, some of the issues like poverty and inequality. But otherwise, there is very little sort of conversation and talk about how what they present, right, to be an alternative finance, alternative business model, alternative future. There's very, very little conversation about what justice actually means and how we can actually tackle economic inequalities. So in a way, they really sort of alleviate, right, the sense of guilt among the rich Muslims more so than kind of solve inequities. And the political elite and the Muslim bourgeois segment sort of defends this current capitalist structure and seeks Islamization without any sort of thorough structural transformation on economic and political fronts. Again, you know, because of our time limitations, I'll jump right into the second group that I focus on, which is the emergent middle class and entrepreneurs. Here, you know, they are represented basically, right? The segment consists of those who do not so much enjoy the clout or transnational ties of political elites. They market their products and services to the middle class, as well as to less affluent populations, and therefore make their profit off of the ripe kind of consumer demand, right, for halal and otherwise religiously compliant goods. Businesses here vary from various, you know, small to medium enterprises that include bakeries, cafes, restaurants, apparel stores, cosmetic and pharmaceutical salons, as well as guest houses, but also microfinance and insurance companies. So some entrepreneurs that I have interviewed and who sort of belong in this broader category, right, of emergent middle-class entrepreneurs, they really complained that their business has not enjoyed the kind of special treatment that the large Islamic banks, for example, have received from the upper echelon government officials. Both in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan, especially when you pay close attention to sort of their day-to-day operations, it is this segment of entrepreneurs that very closely interacts, right, with mid-rank bureaucrats that represent various government agencies that are supposed to sort of oversee the work of private business, right? Among them is, for example, epidemiological station in Kyrgyzstan, but also there are other agencies like tax offices, right, fire station, and so on and so forth, who are closely connected to private business in general, right, in overseeing their immunization records and in overseeing their sanitation standards, their compliance to various sort of government requirements. And in that, I mean, it's really sort of focusing on these spaces allows us to see the kinds of tensions, right, that are, of course, you would say, common for any kind of, right, private business sector. But when it comes to specifically also businesses where owners are identifying them as Muslim, right, or as halal or Sharia compliant, there's an added layer of contention, I would say. And focusing on these sort of particular procedures such as tax, utility payments, sanitation at the workplace, food storage, immunization of workers, as well as evasive guidelines for what halal really means and what is halal certification, right? You know, in my broader work, I go more in depth as to how that actually looks on a day-to-day basis and demonstrate, right, how entrepreneurs interact with and also view the state. How do they respond to that? Also the secularist kind of critique where, you know, some people will say, well, you know, they're not really, they say that they are halal compliant, but I'm not sure, right, how clean, for example, their kitchen is, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting to sort of get into that. Here's a very quick quote from one of the respondents who runs a cafe, right, halal compliant cafe. And she was basically talking about how she thought she was complying to all of the rules when it comes to halal. But then, you know, she was saying, like, she had this revelation, right? It turns out we had been eating all kinds of things that include haram ingredients, you know, including candies that contain pork gelatin, and so on and so forth. So, you know, this quote is just to kind of give you a sense of, it's to illustrate, right, how much concern there is in the segment of entrepreneurs around the kinds of procedures, right, that they think really help them to instill, right, and to incorporate religious requirements into their business practices. There's a lot of talk around that. I have also a separate sort of paper that is coming out of my dissertation that specifically looks at halal certification and the kinds of concerns and, you know, sort of procedural measures that both entrepreneurs, but also the state authorities, and then on the third side, you know, these independent third-party halal certifiers, right, kind of impose on the sector. So, you know, these repertoires of contention that I mentioned, right, among pious entrepreneurs in this segment and mid-rank bureaucrats around issues also of bribe extortion are very salient, but also kind of these conversations of unjust treatments of workers in some businesses, right, as opposed to Islamic businesses. They're very salient in this sector as well. So the entrepreneurs here, however, one of the sort of my findings, right, by looking at their discourses, their sort of day-to-day practices, is that they do not really still attempt, right, to raise and address broader issues of clientelism, abuses of power, and questions of inequality through their sort of informally affiliated groups. They focus so much more on sort of the procedures of how to make something halal, as opposed to how do we sort of address other sort of broader social questions. Finally, there's the group of Muslim Precariat, right? The Muslim Precariat is made up of rural migrants, ethnic minorities, other, you know, what you may call dispossessed groups, who participate in otherwise unoccupied, right, sectors of the Islamic economy, such as bazaars, kiosks that offer religious literature, Muslim attire, posters and DVDs, and other kinds of goods. So really in my sort of conversations, in my also kind of participant observations of Quran study groups among these entrepreneurs, what I see is that they feel really ostracized, right, by the political elite, by the pious kind of bourgeois visions of Islam and development. And therefore, they're really attracted to kinds of articulations of Islam that direct their attention to more inward cultivation of godly devotion, right, and outwardly expression of piety through the means of personal conduct. So there's a lot of talk about what is the right way to wear a veil, for example, especially, you know, among women, how to dress properly, right? What kind of beard is acceptable or unacceptable? How do we not, as entrepreneurs, right, small scale entrepreneurs, not cheat, for example, the customers, right, using kind of the scales. And really sort of at the core of this Muslim precariat are those kinds of conversations, right? How do you make sure yourself, sort of through your inward looking kind of practices, right, pious practices, how do you make sure that you are the best of a Muslim that you can be, right, both in your domestic life but also in the market. So yeah, and these seemingly sort of minute actions are the means of affirming their piety, right? Here is another quick quote, which I thought was very revealing and interesting. So many of the Muslim precariat in Kyrgyzstan actually have they have espoused the Tablighi Jamaat as one of the, they see Tablighi Jamaat as sort of, it resonates, right, with them. And Tablighi Jamaat is known as this sort of missionary Muslim right movement, Islamic movement. They organize Dawat groups and sort of extended pilgrimage trips and so forth. So respondents who joined Dawat groups describe their proselytization trips as communal bonding time, as well as the leverage that they have over state and central muftiyat aligned mosques. So one of the quotes here, as you see, one of my respondents, he was a bazaar trader. He describes, if they are like a river that satiates the thirst of those who come to them, meaning sort of the Islam that they see being promoted by the muftiyat, right, and by government authorities. He says, we are like a rainstorm that gets to the non-believers who may not realize their need in Islam. Sort of he really sees Dawat and Tablighi Jamaat in general as being kind of the better, right, way to practice Islam. And then he brings these visions into his sort of very micro scale business, and then talks, you know, in very minute details, right, how on a day-to-day basis he tries not to cheat, you know, how to be sort of honest with his partners, right, but also with micro loan company where he borrows money, and so on and so forth. I think I maybe I need to wrap up, right, because of the time. So I'll jump into the discussion and in conclusion. So the key argument really that I'm trying to sort of make in this talk, right, is that despite the economy of poverty that the Quran posits as central, religious authorities and practitioners of the Islamic economy in Central Asia have been neglecting this question of how do we tackle growing social inequality and the kind of divide between the haves and have-nots that is actually becoming wider and wider. Imams and market practitioners of the Islamic economy, as well as the broader civil society, do not really use the tools of Islamic discourse to address these social inequalities. They will admit that they exist, right? But that they will not necessarily sort of drive those conversations, especially when it comes to questions of abuse of power by corrupt government officials, as I said, growing divides between haves and have-nots, and injustices based on class, ethnic, and particularly gender divides. So all of those are sort of, they get left out, right, from these kinds of conversations and discourse. Most of the discourse then, in practice are focused on procedural justice rather than social outcome-based justice. Hence Islam, I conclude, right, has wielded the spirit of market participation really in contemporary Muslim Asia and in Central Asia in this case. And so this ethos facilitated the rise of capitalism while sort of mitigating the sufferings of the poor and their sense of injustice, right? So for example, the Tablighi Jamaat members saying, oh, I may be poor, but I have my davat, I have my group, right? And I'm fine, I will be, rewarded maybe in the afterlife and so forth, right? But also it appeases kind of the sense of guilt among the wealthier, right, strata. So I will stop here and thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to all of the questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Botoeva, for a really fascinating and rich presentation. I know we all look forward to hearing more about your project. I'm Sarah Phillips. I'm the director of the Russian and East European Institute here at Indiana University. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. That's Dr. Sufyan Zhimukhov, who is Associate Research Professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. His areas of expertise include ethnic politics, post-Soviet politics, nationalism, Islam, and the Caucasus. Among other publications, he is co-author of the books Putin's Olympics, The Sochi Games and the Evolution of 21st Century Russia, published by Routledge in 2017, and also Mass Religious Ritual and Intergroup Tolerance, The Muslim Pilgrim's Paradox, published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. The latter book received the 2019 Best Book Award from the International Studies Association. Zhimukhov is also an award-winning performer, having received the 2020 Artist Award from the National Storytelling Network. And if you haven't watched Sufyan's storytelling performances, including Flirting Like an American and From Russia Without Love, I highly recommend going to sufyanz.com to hear his compelling and unique stories. And Dr. Zhimukhov's talk this afternoon is entitled Hajj in Russia, State Policy and Industry Management. Welcome, Sufyan.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction. I will talk about economy, Hajj economy, and Hajj is one of 5 pillars of Islam, and it has become an organized mass activity for Russia's Muslims over the past 3 decades. And filling the Hajj quotas allocated by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Russia's Islamic communities have sent between 13,000 to 26,000 pilgrims to Mecca each year since 1991. And this presentation draws on field work in Russia that my colleague and co-author Mikhail Alexeyev of San Diego State University and I conducted in 2008 through 2010, and then we published a book in 2017. And the key insight into the effect of pilgrimage and economy of pilgrimage came through analysis of our 4 focus group conversations that we had in mid-2010 in Nalchik, Kabardino-Balkaria, and my own pilgrimage in 2009 as participant observer for our research. And I will start with kind of a quick historical excursus, since among the 5 pillars of Islam, Hajj is the easiest to evaluate because it requires crossing borders and international travel. So even before states developed modern custom institutions, it was possible to evaluate Hajj industry indirectly for example, by the fact that many pilgrims added title Haji to their names. And in many languages, including in Circassian language, my native language, there are names that just correspond, that just have part Hajj in them. So these modern and archaic indicators help to evaluate Russia's state policy in industry management of Hajj since like all the way back to Mongol Empire through the division of Sharia schools to the Soviet era and nowadays. So this is a map where that shows how Muslim population was distributed in Russia, and particularly in Soviet Union. In Russian Federation, it was mostly, and it is mostly North Caucasus and Volga-Ural region. And outside Russia, former Soviet republics that have Muslim majorities include Azerbaijan in the Caucasus and 5 Central Asian republics. As soon as Islam arrived to the Caucasus and Volga, Hajj became one of the common procedures, and we know that Mongols traveled to Mecca, and in 1367, Khan Haji Cherkess took the Golden Throne, and the name Cherkess indicates that he had close relations with the Caucasus, while title Haji shows that he went to Mecca accompanied by Cherkess princes at the time. The Russian Empire established a Muslim spiritual assembly, and it dictated the Russian policy, meanwhile, among Russian Muslims, the Shariatization of the population split the practices between Hanafi and Shafi rituals. And at this time, usually the elderly performed Hajj, hoping to die in Mecca. And also, there are evidences that political elites combined Hajj with diplomatic missions. Hajj was prohibited by Russian authorities during the Caucasus War twice, and Russian authorities required Hajj as ideological background of the Caucasus resistance. And meanwhile, it was a little bit like on the other side of this process was that mass exodus of the Russian Muslims several times after Russia colonized the Caucasus was going on pretext of Hajj. So it is really hard to evaluate number of Hajjis during this time because most of them didn't go to Hajj, but just immigrated under pretext of Hajj. And this is the time also when women started performing Hajj, and not only male, but also female names emerged with Ruth Haji, Kaaba, and Mecca. And during the Soviet time, at the beginning of Soviet era, Bolsheviks supported Islam and used it to centralize power. However, as soon as Islam became, as soon as Russia established Soviet rule, Soviet power became strong, Bolsheviks, true to their ideology, initiated the Islamization of Russian Muslims and destruction of all mosques and prohibited Hajj. and only World War II kind of revived Hajj and Islam when German occupation, Nazis tried to use this ideology. And after World War II, actually, Stalin also decided to use Islam in Hajj for the state, for the purpose of the state. And in 1943, state-controlled spiritual administrations of Muslims were established in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. And today what we have actually is the legacy of those institutions. So in 1945, Soviet Muslims were allowed to participate in Hajj. However, these state-controlled spiritual administrations vetted these Muslims really hard, and two groups of Muslims annually traveled to Mecca, but there was not a single case of defecting of Muslims abroad during Soviet time, which is remarkable because we know how many actors, athletes, writers defected from Soviet Union to the West, but not a single Haji defected, pilgrim defected to Saudi Arabia, which shows that these groups were really heavily vetted. As with the Soviet Union falling apart, the spiritual administrations also fell apart and created regional Islamic institutions. And this is the time when the religious dynamic in Russia changed. Here you can see a graphic that shows that in 1989, only the people who identified themselves as religious, Orthodox Christian or Muslim, were in real minority, while by mid 2010s, very few people in Russia identified themselves as non-believers. And on this chart, Muslims fall under category of other religions because they still remain minority. However, this other religion, you can see it's also a significant number. And coming to our days, the two regions that I mentioned have significant Muslim population and send Muslims to Hajj are North Caucasus, which includes 7 republics, and Volga region, which includes 2 republics. And in case of Russia, when we use the term republic, it means that these regions are so-called have non-Russian titular ethnic group. And that titular ethnic group can be a minority or majority, but nevertheless, it is not considered as ethnic Russian region if it's called republic. So these Muslim regions can be divided into 2 categories. One category is northeastern Caucasus, which is represented by 3 republics, Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia. And in these 3 republics, Muslims are absolute majority. This situation got developed during 2 Chechen wars when most of Russian ethnic population left these 3 regions. And meanwhile, other republics, including 4 North Caucasus republics in the Northwest Caucasus and 2 Volga republics, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, in Volga-Ural region, and Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia, Adygea, North Ossetia in the Caucasus, they can be regarded as different from Northeast Caucasus. And here you can see that the number of the Muslim population in these republics is significantly lower than in northeastern republics. You can see that in 3 of those republics, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia, and Tatarstan, Muslims represent a majority, over 50%, while in other 3 republics, Adygea, North Ossetia, and Bashkortostan, Muslims represent a minority. So this kind of allows to divide these regions into 2 groups. And this division reflects also major practices in Hajj, performing Hajj. Another division, which I already mentioned historically, that historically emerged in 19th century, is Islamic practices between Shafi school and Hanafi school. So for example, when I was performing Hajj in 2009, I performed it as representative of Hanafi school. And there was a small Shafi school in our group presented by pilgrims who used the quota from Kabardino-Balkaria. I will talk about quotas a little bit later. So this another group from Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia, they performed Hajj according to Shafi schools. And I observed how these practices were quite different. And because our group was divided into 2 subgroups, each of subgroups had its own imam who led us to perform Hajj according to the school that we belonged. And just briefly want to remind that there are 4 major schools in Sunni Islam, and out of those 4 schools, 2 are represented in Russia. Shafi school is represented in Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia, and Hanafi school is represented in other regions. Also, besides the difference in the share of Muslim population and Islamic practices, the state-church relation is quite different between these 2 groups. Islam is incorporated in the political machine in Ingushetia, Chechnya, and Dagestan, and the leaders of these republics and their political elite performs Hajj and goes and prays in mosques openly, while leaders of other republics, they are more discreet in practicing Islam, if they practice it at all. And if they visit a mosque, instantly the same day or next day, they usually, for political correctness, visit an Orthodox church. So these are major divisions in between Islamic regions in Russia, and these divisions also reflect on very many different levels, including in quotas. And Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Chechnya usually get bigger quotas than other republics. In the beginning, in 1990s, the quotas were just divided according to the Muslim population. However, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Chechnya would always exceed their quotas, and many pilgrims from those republics had to travel on other regions' quotas. While the other regions that I mentioned, they often don't even fill the lower quota, and every year their quota goes down. And as I mentioned, in my group from Kabardino-Balkaria, there were subgroups of pilgrims from Ingushetia, Dagestan, Chechnya, Karacháyevo, Cherkessia. The economy of Hajj underwent several stages since the collapse of Soviet Union and in modern Russia. First, it went through the legalization of Islam, and during this time, Saudi Arabia actively developed Hajj industry, helped to advertise Hajj in Russia, and the first 1,500 pilgrims from the Soviet Union in 1990 were funded by the king of Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia offered 13,000 free trips on the Hajj per year for several years. And if you didn't get in those free trips, it would cost you back then 17,000 rubles, while the average salary was below 3,000 rubles. So that was really hard for most people to afford. Later in 1902, 1908, there was institutionalization of Islam, and the republics established muftiyats, so-called spiritual boards of Muslim, and those muftiyats started managing Hajj, and since 1998, more and more states started controlling muftiyats and centralized Hajj industry. So Hajj became a very well-established industry in Russia, in many ways similar to tourism industry. Russia Hajj Mission is an institutional umbrella for coordinating Hajj issues with the religious councils of Muslims, regional councils of Muslims, the muftiyats that I mentioned. And Russia has a special commissioner of Hajj affairs of the government of Russian Federation in Saudi Arabia, and the same person, right now it is Ilyas Omakhanov from Dagestan. He also holds the post of Vice Speaker of Russia's Federal Council. So it shows how well this Hajj industry is integrated in Russian structures. So the commissioner negotiates with Saudi Arabia for annual Hajj quotas, and then the quotas are divided between North Caucasus and Volga. And then muftiyats give licenses to Hajj travel agencies. And in every region, there are several travel agencies. So for example, in Dagestan, there is travel agency Marva Tour. In Chechnya, travel agency Safar Tour, Adel Hajj in Tatarstan. And these travel agencies usually have the same agents who are also imams, and they performed Hajj dozens of times. The leader of my group performed Hajj 16 times by 2009 when I performed it. And these agencies routinized the pilgrimage, the coast transportation services, hotel accommodations, tour operators, travel safeties, health concerns, documentation requirements. There is a doctor in every Hajj group. There are everything is taken care of. It's really well developed industry, and these groups, dozens of them, some of them go with direct flight from Chechnya, Dagestan, and Mineralnye Vody, Others go by bus tours from Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, and Mineralnye Vody. Some even travel by their own private cars. And since yes?
I just wanted to let you know you have about 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I will wrap up really quick, yeah. And here you see a certificate that the Muftiyat started issuing in 2019, so I didn't have that certificate. So the Hajj costs changed really dramatically since 1991, and as you can see, the gender balance also changed, and regional codes changed. If regions were getting like Tatarstan 5,500, Bashkortostan 300, while Dagestan, Chechnya 4,000. By 2019, that completely changed, and 3 northeastern Caucasus republics were getting more quotas, while others were getting less quotas. And in 2020, Hajj has been canceled because of COVID-19, and just 10,000 people traveled around the world to Mecca instead of 3 million people. And to conclude very quickly, want to say that Hajj industry reflects the social and regional dynamics of Islam, including socio-economic realities of class, gender, and age, as well as political relations between major state and the Muslim groups like Muftiyats, Sufism groups, and Salafis. Thank you very much, and sorry for running over time.
Okay, thank you very much for a great paper. It's my pleasure now to introduce our third speaker, Professor Patricia Sloan White. She holds a DPhil from the University of Oxford, and she's currently a faculty in 2 departments in the University of Delaware, Women and Gender Studies and Anthropology. But I find equally interesting on her vita the fact that she spent, it appears, about a decade in business in Wall Street before she joined the ranks of the academia. So she went down considerably in salary, I'm sure, as a result of that change, but perhaps more interesting questions to be asked. In any event, she's going to take us to Malaysia for the next paper, and I will, without further ado, turn it over to Professor Sloan White. Thank you. And then after Professor Sloan White, I'll introduce the discussant.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so delighted that we finally can meet together like this, although it's different from how we originally conceived it. Now, today I'm going to be talking about my ethnographic research in Malaysian corporations, ones which have not only Islamized their financial practices, but, as I will explain, have also Islamized the corporation itself. Over the 30 years that I have been conducting ethnographic research on the economic practices of Muslims in Malaysia, Malaysia, already an economic success story in Southeast Asia, has also become one of the most successful innovators in the field of Islamic economics. The government has invested millions of dollars to advance its position as a producer of Sharia-compliant financial products. It has also funded the vast professionalization of the Sharia scholars who approve the financial products available to both the retail and corporate customer. In Malaysia, the term muamalat, or the fiqh of commerce and monetary dealing, that is what you can do with in an Islamic economy, is highly regulated by the central bank called Bank Negara in Malaysia. Bank Negara appoints, after very careful vetting, a very elite, highly elite body of several dozen Sharia scholars to serve as professional Sharia advisors to the central bank. I've worked closely with a number of these Sharia advisors, experts in the fiqh of Mamulat, who help create and officialize Sharia-compliant products. The man in the picture serves as the chairman of the Sharia Advisory Board to Bank Negara. His name is Dr. Daud Bakar, and I've studied the power and the influence of men like Daud Bakar, who hold the advancement of Malaysia's Islamic economy in their hands. I've studied closely the relationships that connect them to each other and connect them to the Malaysian state and its institutions. This group of Sharia advisors is small in number. Its membership is highly regulated by Malaysia's central bank. And let me say that this is a good thing, because Malaysia's Sharia advisors must comply with very rigorous standards. For example, in Malaysia, you can serve as a Sharia advisor only to one bank and one Islamic insurance company. And by contrast, in jurisdictions which do not regulate Sharia advisory board members in this way, Sharia advisors can serve multiple institutions. In one Muslim country, Sharia advisors reportedly serve as many as 80 banks. But Malaysia has absolutely professionalized, regulated the process of becoming a Sharia advisor at a level that no other jurisdiction has, thereby creating a small, highly efficient, highly professional, and highly elite group of Sharia advisors who answer to the central bank. The Sharia advisors that I've studied, like Daud Bakar, have very interesting backgrounds. They're generally very young, and they are very much a product of late 20th century Islamization, as I understand it, in Malaysia. Most of them were educated either in Malaysia at its highly successful and sophisticated International Islamic University. Others studied in the Middle East, attending places like Al-Azhar or the University of Jordan. Universities like that, of course, are common training grounds for religious professionals in Malaysia. But the Sharia advisory elite, which I study, has something more than that. Most of them, if not now all of them, have earned a doctorate, and most often in a field like Islamic economics and not just Sharia study, in a field like Islamic economics, and most often they've earned it at universities in the United Kingdom, at places like Newcastle University, Edinburgh, Loughborough, St. Andrews, the University of Wales, or elsewhere. Daud Bakar went to got his doctorate at St. Andrews. And to my mind, the consequences of this progression matters a lot. Because unlike the ulama of the Malaysian religious bureaucracy, this elite, this financial elite, is much more cosmopolitan and much more global in orientation. In their own terms, they're people who move smoothly in many worlds: Malaysian, Arab, Western, religious, academic, financial, and secular. And I think the picture of Daud Bakar tells you what these men look like, how they present themselves. Dr. Daud once described himself to me, and I'm quoting here, as a man of the market and the mosque. And I use this phrase to think about the influence that men like him have. They're impeccable in their Islamic and their Western pedigrees. They present their scholarship worldwide and locally. They publish articles justifying Malaysia's Sharia interpretations in journals funded by the central bank. They speak at international conferences, describing Malaysia's innovative and often path-breaking Sharia-compliant investment products. And many of them engage in global consulting, like Dr. Daud does. Dr. Daud runs a global Islamic financial consultancy called Amani Global Islamic, with offices worldwide. He serves on boards of Middle Eastern businesses and banks. Others serve on the boards of banks in Hong Kong, Singapore, and London, and other banks with Islamic interests and subsidiaries. Most of them consult to organizations such as huge data processing centers, which are seeking to generate Sharia-compliant operations for the global Islamic market, and they help European and Japanese banks set up their Sharia-compliant divisions. But in my talk today, I want to explore the influence they have back in Malaysia, where in addition to their powerful role in the Islamic economy, they play a key role in many of the top Muslim-run and Muslim-owned corporations that I study, and in the spiritual lives of many of the top Muslim businessmen that I study in Malaysia. They have, in fact, become like go-to experts in establishing the Islamicity of everyday Muslim Malaysian corporate life. That is, they regulate the Sharia practices of muamalat in the Islamic economy, but they also regulate the Sharia practices of what I call corporate Islam. Increasingly, they become advisors to the Islamicity of both the spiritual and the human resources of corporate leaders as well. I'm talking today about material from my book, Corporate Islam in Malaysia, in which I discuss how many of the corporate Muslim executives and CEOs I know in Malaysia consult a Sharia advisor, someone like Dr. Daud Bakar, sometimes even daily, for guidance in every aspect of running their businesses. They want advice not only on how to Islamize the financing and the investments of their companies, but how to Islamize the entire corporate operation. I call the Sharia scholars that I've studied and the business leaders that I've studied together the corporate Sharia elite. And I call the Sharia that they've constructed together, as in the title of my book, Corporate Islam. But before I proceed to discuss the Islamization of corporate life, I want to note a certain Sharia paradox that exists in Malaysia's Islamic economy. Malaysia's Sharia advisors, as scholars of Islamic finance, share views on Islamic finance which, in their own words, are flexible. But what they mean by flexible is that they seek to generate for the global Islamic financial marketplace a Sharia that, in their terms, is realistic for modern capitalist life. In fact, their flexibility sometimes earns Malaysia's products the disapprobation of other Sharia scholars in the Organization of Islamic Countries, or the OIC. For example, the muamalat informing and shaping Malaysia's sukuk offerings and several of its other financial products are increasingly inadmissible in other Muslim jurisdictions. The Sharia advisors I study explain their structuring of sukuk as permissibly flexible so as to accommodate the complexity of modern global financing, criticizing those Sharia experts who resist that. So my point is that the muamalat of making product, of investing in product, and the borrowing of money in Malaysia has become increasingly flexible. But over the last few decades, Sharia concerning the regulation of Muslim persons in Malaysia has become significantly less flexible. And therefore, in my talk, I point to the paradox between muamalat, that which regulates money, and how flexible it is, and the increasingly inflexible and increasingly restrictive and intolerant Malaysian Sharia of munakahat, that is the Sharia for persons, or what is generally called personal status law. Over the years that I've been studying in Malaysia, studying Islamic economic life, the Malaysian state has sought to make Sharia, munakahat, much more uniform, much more authoritative, much more conservative, and in the minds of some commentators, increasingly more intrusive into the private lives and public moralities of Malaysian Muslims. And so in my work, what I do is I follow Malaysia's increasingly authoritative Sharia for persons into the public space of work, into corporate life, where I conduct ethnographic research in cubicles, conference rooms, hallways of sizable, highly visible corporate Islamic workplaces. I find there that elite CEOs and their Sharia advisors, the ones I talked about earlier, the people I call the corporate Sharia elite, have crafted organizational expectations and a corporate ideology that does two things. First, their approach closely reflects principles and languages in the contemporary global capitalist management culture, stating that personnel must align their practices and behavior in according to things like SOPs, or standard operating procedures, and meet KPIs, or key performance indicators. Now, these are terms you might be familiar with if you've been around corporate figures and management consultants. And in fact, in Malaysia, the language of corporate life very much comes from the very significant impact that McKinsey Consulting has had on the development of corporate practice in Malaysia. The second thing that corporate Islamic ideology reflects is a growing understanding and acceptance among Malaysian Muslims that Sharia allows for no plurality of practice or belief, and that its rigorous application must guide and regulate their behavior at all times, not just in their private lives and in their public lives, but also in that space between them. That is, of course, the space at work. And this has had the effect of making work, its various SOPs and KPIs, and all that happens there, increasingly Sharia compliant, which, as any pious Muslim would say, is absolutely reasonable and right. But what I wish to emphasize in my talk is that increasingly it is the elite bosses and their Sharia advisors who empower themselves, like the Malaysian state itself, to decide what compliance to Sharia in the workplace means. That is, to decide where Sharia is flexible and where it is not. The CEOs that I study tell me that, as all Muslims do, they have obligations or fard in two domains. What Muslims traditionally call the domains of fard al-ain and fard al-kafiyah. That is, they're obligated to perform individual duties and communal duties, but what's interesting is how the men I talk to have refashioned these traditional Arabic terms into modern business concepts. To them now, fard al-ain in the corporation means that a CEO will follow ethical business practices in his mamalat, paying, which means not paying or generating interest, not taking bribes, not taking kickbacks, and running what they call a transparent operation. Sometimes they use the term fard al-ain interchangeably with the term corporate governance. Fard al-kifayah, communal responsibilities, has now gotten the McKinsey treatment. It's part of corporate speak, and CEOs use this term to describe all the things their companies do to promote the community beyond the corporation, meaning what they call Islamic corporate social responsibility, or increasingly ICSR. But to me, this is where it gets even more anthropologically interesting, because the men I talk to, doing good communally or for your community, fard al-kifayah, is not just conceived of as doing corporate social responsibility for the community around the corporation, but increasingly that notion of the community is understood to be the corporation itself. In other words, the society or community comprised of the company and its employees must be dealt with in Islamic ways. And therefore, because it's fard al-kifayah, to represent yourself as a Muslim in your community, the CEOs I talk to tell me that Sharia requires them to bring employees towards a more Islamic life as part of their fard, part of their obligation. They increasingly then refer to the role of CEO using the Arabic and Quranic term khalifa, a term which means steward or leader. And this term has become fashionable among Muslim CEOs and managers in Malaysia. I hear it at management conferences, in training programs. I hear it at the Islamic University in business classes, that the Muslim CEO is a khalifa, an Islamic leader. And this turns a very powerful Quranic term, one who stewards the Islamic community, into a very powerful person within corporate life. So here is how one CEO who sees himself as a khalifa told me he recruits people into his company and guides them towards more Islam. And I'm quoting him directly. "We want to know everything about them," he said. We ask questions about their wife or their husband or their children. We ask and we watch, is this a good family, a pious family? Is everyone in this family fulfilling their duties? Is the employee managing his family well? This tells us how they'll perform their job. If we see flaws at home or at work, we'll guide and coach them towards a more Islamic lifestyle. Long after their probation ends, we will watch them. At company events and family days, spouses and children will be observed. There's no faking it in this organization, and those who cannot comply with Islam leave on their own accord. I call the production of these regulations and standards personnel Sharia. Personnel Sharia is in effect the McKinsey-like KPIs and SOPs for Islam. Personnel Sharia is the codes, the procedures, and the regulations for Muslims shaped by corporate leaders and their Sharia advisors and set out as corporate policy. Personnel Sharia shapes the workplaces I study, borrowing its authority, its inflexibility from Malaysia's increasingly inflexible personal status law, its Munangkahat. Personnel Sharia sets out terms of authority that place corporate leaders and managers above their staff, using Sharia principles to structure the hierarchy of the workplace and obligating workers to comply. It infuses the workplace with pious practice, a workplace where increasingly prayer is made mandatory, where imams are brought in to lead lunchtime prayer, and where workers' piety is monitored and advanced at corporate prayer meetings and retreats. Moreover, Personnel Sharia sets out and confirms how Muslims in the corporate Malaysian workplace will dress, how they will act, how they will interact, stating in corporate policy manuals what is permissible and prohibited in their moral and gendered behaviors. Personnel Sharia tells employees to pay their zakat through monthly salary deduction to the centralized zakat institution which has emerged in Malaysia, itself a vast private organization that I have studied, which rigorously enforces Personnel Sharia for its thousands of employees. Personnel Sharia requires workers to engage in corporate social responsibility projects sponsored by their organization on the weekends and after hours. And perhaps most noticeably, Personnel Sharia also shapes and structures the gender roles and the statuses of the workplace, insisting that women wear the hijab, prohibits Western clothes for women while it insists corporate style on white shirts and ties for men. It forbids men and women to socialize together at work or to eat together in the company canteen. And I need to note that this is a change that has come recently to Malaysia, and come recently to Malaysia's workplaces, where, unlike in much of the Arab or Middle Eastern world, Malaysia's was long a culture where Muslim men and women did formally interact comfortably and openly in public life. There are also many SOPs for Sharia in place that closely mirror Malaysia's increasingly male-favoring Sharia laws governing marriage, divorce, and other domestic matters. In other words, Personnel Sharia increasingly mirrors the recent changes that Malaysia has made in personal status law. This means that things like employee benefits, loan programs, and policies concerning healthcare give male employees in many cases greater rights and greater privileges than women have. And although many Muslim Malaysian women are educated as highly as men, and many of them enter STEM fields that women in the West have avoided, when I asked managers why so few women, and more often no women in the companies I studied, had been promoted to management positions or served as executives, the answer was uniform: no woman was suitable for it. Sharia, they say, says so. And therefore women in these companies, even if they had been educated in STEM fields, tended to have caring kinds of jobs such as staffing human resources, working in the training department, public relations, or marketing. And these were jobs that both men and women agreed matched women's temperaments, but mostly their time management needs, the needs of their husbands. Personnel Sharia also says that husbands, have the right to withdraw their wives from employment by speaking to the managers about conflicts at home. And this happened many times in the companies that I studied. And finally, for corporate leaders, self-designed Khalifah, it was clear that in their understanding of Islam, men could be corporate leaders of personnel, but women were always wives first, and because of that, could not be Khalifah. And thus Personnel Sharia has, in effect, become, in my mind, a Sharia bridge that connects the public and the private lives of employees. Bridging the space between the public and the private, to bring a set of requisite and finite and increasingly intolerant Sharia norms into their work lives, where, as in all capitalist economies, people spend the bulk of their waking hours. And thus many CEOs and Sharia advisors tell me that the corporation in effect is like a small Islamic state, where everything and everyone must be ruled by Sharia. And to them, if that is true, then personal Sharia is the law by which its corporate citizens must abide. I want to emphasize that for Muslim people who work in the corporations I study, the experience of work, they say, is an overwhelmingly positive one. The employees I meet not only accede to, but increasingly embrace the rightness of the arguments and the arrangements implied by the conservative gender roles and power hierarchies of their corporate lives. This experience of the Sharia workplace, they say, has given work much more fully, put them on a much more fully path to an Islamic life. And in conclusion, what I'd like to point out then is that when scholars study the growing global Islamic economy, what they generally don't do is look inside the workplace, inside the companies within that economy. Similarly, people who study Islamist politics rarely look at corporate life as a place where some of the principles of a fully Shariaized life are being formulated. But in the corporate Sharia elite that I've studied, the Sharia advisors, the bureaucrats, and the corporate leaders and CEOs I've met, they say they hope that in the near future, the entire Malaysian economy will be run under Islamic principles. They say that they look forward to a day when all Malaysians would be required to abide by the rules and premises of an Islamic economy. And then they say, rather like the thin edge of the wedge, Malaysia itself can become a true Islamic state. But the irony here, and of course the point of this, is that they see it emerging through corporate life. Today the corporation should be run like a small Islamic state, they say. Tomorrow they hope for a real Islamic state. Whether that ever happens in Malaysia, I can't say. But what I would say is that if a fully realized Islamic state is the endpoint that they imagine for a Malaysian future, its beginnings, they say, starts with them, the corporate Sharia elite, the corporation, and the workers they control via the practices of corporate Islam, where corporations have become, in effect, the Islamic State's Shariaized proxy. Its corporate Sharia elites have become that state's leaders, and its personnel have become its highly regulated worker citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating paper, and I have a bunch of questions. We have chosen perhaps the ideal person to be the discussant for these papers. Professor Tariq Siddiqui is the Assistant Professor of Philanthropic Studies and Director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. He has a PhD in Philanthropic Studies and a JD from Indiana University. And so I think he is ideally suited to comment on the themes that that the three papers have discussed. So I will give it over to Professor Siddiqui to commence the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, first to the organizers and the centers for putting together this fascinating panel. I've just absolutely loved every second. And I wanted to also thank all three panelists for a really insightful topic that really takes us across this idea of Islamic economics or the Islamic economy. And, you know, before I go right into their papers, I wanted to sort of take a broader look. Ultimately, this whole conception of Islamic economy comes into this idea or this critique that somehow capitalism or capitalist economy on one side or a controlled economy on the other by themselves are not sort of pushing back against the ideal, right? So not creating that ideal sort of economy that would allow for what Imam Ghazali, the classical scholar, says adl, or social justice, not the justice that you go to court and get, but the justice in which every member of society or every citizen of the state has an equal access to economic resources, to a happy life, and so on. So there's equity within what's happening. And so for a long period of time, and especially this is post 1960s, we've been seeing more and more of these conversations about the ideal Islamic economy. And it takes part largely in 2 or 3 formats. One, the idea of interest or riba being bad, or the second, the important components of the Islamic economy, zakat, for example, which is a 2.5% surplus on surplus wealth, or this broader idea of Islamic finance. And that has resulted, this conversation has resulted in a growth, especially post 1980s, in the development of different forms of Islamic economies over the world. And what's interesting is that in this, I'm going to go into the order, but our last speaker, Malaysia, Patricia Sloan White's presentation of Malaysia. Malaysia is probably the most sophisticated within the trajectory of the work on Islamic finance and Islamic economy. But I'd like to start with Professor Botoeva's present paper, which is fascinating look at Central Asia and the examination of political leaders and Muslim entrepreneurs of, of 3 different levels: the elites, the emerging entrepreneurs or the middle class, and then the broad public, smaller the public at the lower levels, and how they, each of them, draw upon this idea of the Islamic economy, right? And the ideals of practicing faith and Islam, and sort of applying it through economic interests and taking an advantage of the resources that are available or the systems that are available. And it's a fascinating study because of this is largely a pro-Soviet sort of engagement in trying to build a system that will allow people to embrace a very visual and a very open and a very economic sort of engagement with Islam. And I think she provides us some really interesting multi-level analysis of how those groups do it, whether it's the pious bourgeoisie, as she talks about these large Islamic banks that have opportunities, that have the ability and have the power, and they are part of the powerful elite that actually set the rules for within Islamic economy, and therefore they're able to leverage that. You have the emergent middle class that are largely dealing with halal products, and so for Muslims to be able to wear and eat and sort of live a halal or Sharia compliant life. And then you have the people at the lower end of the scale that are trying to sort of deal with the more instant challenges that Muslims have to face. And what's interesting is, as she points out, that the focus of all of this is very procedural, right? It's rather than it's outcome driven, and I'll come back towards that in the end, but it's a very procedural outcome. This is what we have to do. These are the processes that we have to take in place in order for Islamic economy to be in existence, rather than asking the question, what is the result? What is an Islamic economy or an ideal Islamic economy supposed to produce, right? Dr. Sufyan Zhermakov talks about Russia in particular, and talks about Hajj. And Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And Hajj, although it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, it's the only pillar that all Muslims don't have to do. It's only Muslims that are able to financially or are healthy enough to do, right? So if you are too poor to do the Hajj, that sort of you're forgiven for that. You don't have to worry about it. It's only if you can afford to do that. And then largely because, as Professor Zhermakov pointed out, that Hajj requires you to travel to Mecca and Medina and requires that you take on this obligation. And many people just do it once in their lives, if at all. And he points out how in Russia, especially the post-Soviet era, when you have a Hajj industry that is highly regulated and supported, and initially by the King of Saudi Arabia, you can see more equity, right? And I'll come back to that at the end, but you'll see more equity when it comes to the practice of Hajj. More people of different groups can attend, right? But as this Hajj economy becomes more controlled but less supported, and which means that the prices go up, fewer and fewer people can sort of participate. And it's an interesting dilemma for those across the world that are thinking about economic systems that are sort of trying to support Hajj. So for example, in the United States, the Hajj can cost $10,000 to $15,000 to $25,000 per person. And many people from here aren't able to go. But if you see countries like, for example, Ghana or some Muslim majority countries where there's a Hajj ministry, or there's a regulation where the government is engaged in regulating the industry, taking care of its people, but at the same time ensuring that there's equity in who goes, there's some more opportunities in terms of knowing. So when the Islamic economy of Hajj is left to just capitalism, it reduces the amount of people to go as compared to when the Islamic economy is engaged and more regulated and government involvement, the likelihood of more participation would occur. And then finally, I'm rushing through this just because I want to leave more time for questions at the end. Patricia Sloan White gives us a fascinating in-depth look at Malaysia, and specifically the corporate culture within Malaysia. And Malaysia is arguably the most sophisticated and leader within the area of Islamic economics. And they have, as she has shown, given the McKinsey treatment to many of these ideas of muamalat or fard al-ain or fard al-kifaya, etc. And all of these things, these ideas that are ancient and historic ideas, have received modern treatment and translated into modern communal practice or modern corporate practice, so that we can these can be used in modern day practice in Malaysia. And Malaysia has done the most amount of work. But what's interesting is, and this will probably lead me at least to my final point, which is what's interesting is that this idea of Islamic economics started out with this idea of around riba or interest, right? And resulted in Islamic economics became synonymous for a long period of time to Islamic finance, and resulting in these big banks and big finance houses. You have mutual funds like Amana Mutual Fund here in the United States, one of the largest socially conscious mutual fund, and all of this stuff. But what economists and my colleagues in Malaysia and others would show that what's happened is that inequality isn't any different in an Islamic economic environment than it is in a non-Islamic economic environment. And this conversation has resulted in, perhaps we built these great banks and these great pillars and corporate interests around Islamic systems or Islamic ideas with those Islamic terms, but we haven't really built an Islamic economy that sort of pushes away against inequity within society and social inequity in the society. And so the bigger question I think that Islamic economies have to answer is, why is that the case, right? Why, if there's a total embrace of these ideas of zakat and anti-riba and all of these amazing concepts, what are some of the other challenges that Islamic economics can't answer for? Because ideally, if you go back to Imam Ghazali and so on, their belief is that an perfect Islamic economic system will result in to a point where, as in the time of Caliph Umar, that they couldn't find people that were eligible for zakat. And so I'll stop here, but I'm I'm extraordinarily grateful to the three presenters and the organizers for a fascinating talk.
Dr. Siddiqui, thank you so much for that really comprehensive and thoughtful discussion of the papers. We do have a question in the chat from Paul Gosselin, and the question, I'll go ahead and relay it to Dr. Sloan White. His question is, how do non-Muslim Malaysians, for example, of Chinese descent, fit within the corporate Sharia culture and the roles/expectations of personnel Sharia that you described?
That's such a great question, and it's such a great question for Malaysia, which has a significant population of Chinese citizens, overseas Chinese citizens, who have lived in Malaysia for generations and feel increasingly marginalized by the growth of both the Sharia presence in public life, the growth of the Islamic economy. So much of this is tied up with the Malaysian need for Muslims to compete with the Chinese, who are perceived to be better at business. And so much of the growth of corporate life, of professionalization of the Islamic economy, is a way to sort of reduce the impact of who the Chinese are in the economy, in capitalist life. That said, your question is a profound one, because in quite a few of the banks and corporations I've studied, there is a handful of Chinese employees. And when I speak to the CEOs and the managers about the Chinese people, they're so complimentary about how the Chinese accept this. And for example, during Ramadan, when someone can't be at their desk because they're praying or because they're fasting, or at the mosque, the Chinese workers are so eager to help out, because they are beginning to understand, and there's this sort of complex sort of ideology here. They're beginning to understand that Islam is not in any way a threat to them, in many ways because of the capacity of Islam to allow others to engage in its lifestyle, to engage in its economy. The Chinese are fully welcome. And this too is the claim that Malaysia increasingly makes about the Islamic State, that the Chinese are welcome to stay. They have to comply with Islamic practices. The women are not required to wear hijab if you're a Chinese worker, but she must wear very modest clothing. People will attend the Muslim training sessions, the Islamic Quranic readings, because the CEOs tell me the Chinese people want to understand better what Islam is. So that's sort of the ideology from the CEOs downward, that this is a good thing for the Chinese employees. Many of the Chinese people I speak to find working in this atmosphere increasingly uncomfortable, and this has created this sort of vast, this increasing division of Chinese people who work in multinational corporations and Muslim Malaysians who are working in these increasingly powerful Islamized corporations. Several CEOs have told me that what the Chinese employees have learned is that Islam is so wonderful, so accepting, so accommodating, that perhaps even they too will eventually become Muslims. So, again, this is this hope that there will be a greater conversion to Islam. So depending on who I talk to, I hear how positive this is or how uncomfortable it makes certain employees who then, as the one CEO said, people who cannot comply must leave.
Wow, that's so very interesting. Thank you so much. Our colleague, Professor Marian Camp, has a question that she would like to pose.
So this is just a brief question for Aisalkyn, and then for anyone else who has something to say on it. Aisalkyn, at the beginning of your talk, you kind of contrast a Quranic idea of economy of poverty, and I'd like to hear more about what that is, and also to what extent that is ever talked about. My impression from many trends that I can observe or have read about in Islamic economy is that there's a heavy emphasis on the believer's need to do the right thing, and that's why you have to have lending without riba, and you have to have the right kinds of foods and stuff. But I wonder, and also I hope Sharik Siddiqui will also address this, what about the bigger picture? Is there any even talk about the idea that this ought to produce a better and healthier society other than at the level of piety?
Great. Thank you so much for that question, Marian. And I think it's really fascinating, and it's something that, as I mentioned during my talk, I've been in this effort of reframing my project in general, because it's interesting, right? How you sort of work on your dissertation, and then it occurs to you at the very end, oh, that is what, that is really what the key argument is. And so it was towards the end when I sort of started focusing on this issue of how, there's so much talk about procedure, right? And there's very little when it comes to sort of the economy of poverty. And economy of poverty perhaps is really more it comes as a term, at least, right? More from the scholarly tradition. And therefore, when it comes to sort of religious authorities and imams, and especially, pious Muslims themselves, you may not necessarily, that's not an emic kind of term, but there, in my interviews, I have extensively discussed, how do they view in general, right? Sort of given their knowledge of Islam and the kinds of tenets really at the core of it, how do they view, inequalities, right? Especially in economic inequalities that are just widening and growing in the region. And so it was interesting for me, and I think that's where sort of sociology, anthropology, social science in general comes in, right? Sort of studying how people take something and then make it their own. And so a lot of my respondents, especially in interviews conducted in Kyrgyz, they would talk about, the besh parmak tengimes, right? For example, sort of just showing on 5 fingers and saying, well, look, 5 fingers aren't, of the same length, right? And sort of this kind of, it comes from the Kyrgyz saying, and sort of that would be in the very beginning of the conversation, and usually used in reference to, well, inequality is something that we sort of live with, right? And not necessarily perhaps should be tackled, and especially when it comes to questions of, how do we as Muslims practice the right Islam and make sure that we are doing everything in the right way? Yes, there would be quite a bit of talk about charity, charitable action, all kinds of ways in which we can sort of help the poor, right? But those conversations, from at least what I have seen so far, right, in various, even if you look at the sermons, right, that imams give, there's not so much attention given to this, again, right, the outcome-based kind of results. Instead of saying, yes, Islam posits that there should be justice, and we should be, right, as human beings, as societies, sort of strive towards equality, and that's what, kind of Islam posits. There's very little of that, and instead, sort of this justification as to why inequality actually exists, and how should we just sort of take it as a given. That has been my observation.
Thank you so much. Dr. Siddiqui, did you want to weigh in on Marianne's question as well?
Sure. Briefly, I would just say the same thing. I think the 3 challenges that you're hearing, right? The number one is this post-colonial kind of emergence of Islamic states. Where in the colonial period of time, there was oppression on practice, right? And then if you think about Central Asia, that's even much more recent, that oppression continues. And so the emphasis right now amongst leaders in some of these the people that come to these Islamic banking conferences is, look, right now we need to focus on procedural because we haven't gotten it down for so long. So let's focus on the process right now because the process has been what's been missing. So we're behind, and we're behind by a few hundred years, and we have to catch up on the procedure. And I think Dr. Sloan White really sort of exemplifies what's happening in Malaysia and how it's amazing. The second thing the second piece of rhetoric that you'll hear is that, look, we figured out the process, as Malaysia is an example of that, right? But we're just not good at it, right? You know, it's because we're not all paying zakat. It's because we're not observing this idea of riba. It's because we're not all participating uniformly. That's the second argument. So until we start embracing the procedure, all of us, this is going to remain a problem. And then the final argument is, look, this Islamic economic system is coming together in a time where it's largely, the global economic system is largely non-Islamic. So if you think about the biggest economies, the US, or China, Russia, Brazil, none of these countries are Muslim, and they are the dominant forces within the system. So for somehow these systems are systems that are so interconnected to somehow come together and sort of create that a perfect system where it will work right away. That's not happen. That won't happen. But if we do our job well, and if we show the success, maybe we can do as Patricia talks about, which is that we'll have these other people embrace our system. And it's only when the entire world has embraced these beautiful principles that we're going to see that outcome. And so, and that's why the focus is all on procedural and self-correction.
Thank you. And Sufyan Jemukhov wanted to respond to Dr. Siddiqui, I believe, and some of your comments.
Yeah, just the comment that Dr. Siddiqui made about change of equity in Hajj economy really made me think about compensatory mechanisms that has been developed. So like indeed, as Dr. Siddiqui said, initially it was more, there were more equity and Saudi Arabia was helping, but then the situation changed because prices went up and Russia also became more capitalistic. So this actually became really evident during 1998 economic crisis. And also since 2014, thanks to sanctions, Russian economy has been declining. So in response to this economic decline and crisis, Russian Muslim community actually developed compensatory mechanisms. And since so like two major mechanisms. One is that after the 1998 crisis, Hajj organization assistance programs emerged in Russia that helped to compensate part of the cost. So for example, you would pay 50% and then these organizations, charitable organizations would help you with 50% others. Also, there is this part of Hajj that people can pay pilgrims to perform Hajj for the sponsor. So sometimes you don't even have to go. If you're rich, you just pay somebody to perform Hajj for you. And for example, in 2009, when I was performing Hajj, half a dozen of pilgrims were performing Hajj not for themselves, for somebody else. So your first Hajj you perform for yourself, and then after that, you can just take money from somebody, of course not for profit, but to compensate your trip, and then you perform Hajj for somebody else. So these are really good mechanisms to address these economic issues.
That's great. Thank you, Sufyan. We have two more questions in the chat that let's try to get to. The first is from Carl Pearson, and it is for Dr. Botoeva. And Carl writes, what is the institutional structure for articulating and enforcing Sharia compliance for your mid-level bourgeoisie? What is the government's role in establishing or regulating these institutions? And what are the Muslim leaders' role?
Yeah, that's a very good set of questions, and thank you for that. So by institutional structures, I imagine, the question is more about sort of the spaces, right? And the kind of formalized, perhaps, organizations or associations, or informal ones, right? And correct me if I'm misunderstanding the question. But yeah, so to answer it, I would say, especially when it comes to the mid-level kind of emerging, right, middle-class entrepreneurs, I usually, sort of focus more on the members of the Gulen movement in Kyrgyzstan, who are very active. And specifically, I focus on them because, they really are the sort of the product of a very wide network, right? It started off as sort of the Gulen movement coming from Turkey, and they would use their sponsors to set up schools, right, in Kyrgyzstan, but also across former Soviet countries. And a lot of those graduates, right, sort of grew into, right, these roles of being middle-aged, young, very ambitious, emergent kind of middle class, where a lot of them are now leaders, kind of owning, but also managing various kinds of private businesses, construction companies, and they work in different sectors. And so what ended up happening there in that example is they have, for example, come together to establish Jash Ishkever Assotsiatsiyasi, which basically is a young entrepreneurs association. It was established by, mostly, right, the Gulen School graduates, and then they have been able to attract others. And it really has become a very attractive platform, this business association, for a lot of other entrepreneurs, because they see how effective they actually are, right? Because they sort of, to your question of how they may connect to government authorities, they really collaborate with only very select government officials who have been sympathetic, right, to kind of their cause. And they really position themselves as these progressive kind of Muslim. Speaking of spaces, again, this business association has many, many different tentacles, right, where they sort of have their own independent radio agency. They have their own independent, newspapers, right, that they publish for interested audiences. They have their own Muslim daycares that they sort of invest in, and schools, right? And, so it's sort of, and speaking of religious authorities, they also actually, I have interviewed sort of a separate group of religious authorities whose mosques are specifically funded by them too, right? So, all together, if you look at them sort of kind of combined, right? All of these spaces, not just private business, right? But as I mentioned, all of the, the news outlets and schools, right? Educational institutions, all of those could be seen as spaces and institutions through which this rhetoric now is kind of being promoted, right? The rhetoric of, we are the progressive sort of Muslims, we are, going sort of in hand with the, with time, we're not lagging behind, we're not backward, right? That's how they position themselves. And especially when it comes to sort of the government, I would say they really try to defy government intervention, sort of, right, in these spaces. And they do so, again, by selectively cultivating, right, ties with government authorities that are sympathetic to their cause, and mostly collaborating with, I would say, actually third party when it comes to halal, for example, right? What are the procedures? How do we make sure that we can import but also export our products, right? Outside, they collaborate closely actually with third party halal certifiers, who in turn also have been, trying to sort of, it's a competing thing, right? It's a competing, it's a dynamic of competing for authority. Who has the authority to say what is halal? right? So in these spaces, third-party certifiers have been coming in and saying, well, the government cannot just usurp, right, and use their power. We are independent. And this is something that I have presented elsewhere, sort of looking at certifiers and how they also gain their authority by tapping onto this transnational network, right? Especially Malaysian certifiers who give them the accreditation, right? Accreditation that they receive, then the Kyrgyz and Kazakh certifiers, they always sort of use that as you know, to kind of bolster, right, their reputation and saying, look, you know, we're not just looking at the government and what they have to say, but we're actually working with transnational authorities like Malaysian certifiers. And really Malaysia is regarded as kind of the hub now of that kind of knowledge, and procedural, especially procedural kind of sort of procedural steps, right, of how to make sure that we're producing halal goods and services. I hope that answers the question, but I'm happy to talk more and to continue this even after the workshop. Thank you for those questions.
Well, thank you so much for that. And we have actually come to the end of our time, so I apologize. We can't address any more questions, but let's try to squeeze in Morgan Liu's really fascinating question here in the chat. So it's for any panelist. So anyone who would like to take it up in the short time we have left. Morgan asks, have you seen evidence of Muslim business people or scholars trying to work out how Islamic principles could address not just inequality in wealth, but unjust structural differences in the political economy that make some subject to exploitative clientel relations? The issue is perhaps about scaling up Islamic piety to a societal level. So really fascinating question. Who would like to field that?
I'll certainly be happy to start. I mean, in many ways, I think this is what the Khalifa CEO Sharia advisors that I'm talking to think they're doing. That if you can create it in everyday work life first, the corporation, if you can model these behaviors and Islamicize everyday life in the way that Sharia speaks to the path of everything, that you will create a population of people who have effectively brought Islam into all public life. So this notion that that the company is a proxy for the future, I think is very much in their thoughts, but also in Malaysia the vast corporatization of zakat and the tax advantages given to corporations that use their dollars to pay for ICSR, or Islamic CSR. In many ways, they think they're speaking to this. Corporations I study invest tremendously in corporate social responsibility for Islamic purposes. They get tax advantages for it. They're building hospitals. They're training vast numbers of entrepreneurs. They've created universities that will be free for the poor. Everything is about uplifting the poor, but using corporate dollars to do it, using philanthropy, and without much consciousness. The people tell me, like, this is what built America. These are the Rockefellers and the great capitalists of the past who have funded institutions, funded hospitals, funded culture, and that if this is all done through the Islamic corporation, through corporate social responsibility, by these people who are so well informed and informed by their Sharia advisors, that this will naturally swing society over to a much more equitable society. I mean, the irony, of course, is that it's built upon the image of the corporation, and that it's the corporation that's funding this. when I asked my informants, well, but aren't corporations hierarchical, and aren't they, is that Islamic? And people tell me, you don't understand Islam. Islam itself accepts hierarchy, that, you are at the top of the organization because you deserve to be there. You're the driver of the CEO because that's your specialty. We'll pay the driver fairly for his expertise, and therein is equity. And, people will point to hadith that tell me that this is exactly what an Islamic, a fully Islamicized society will look like. And there's a great, there's this increasing conversation that if you look back at Medina, this is, this sort of golden age, this is how things were operating. And if you just put in place more Islam, you will bring about this betterment. But it has to be fueled with money. It has to be fueled with more money, and then all boats will rise, and everybody will get their share. So I mean, this vast philanthropic move in Malaysia to take your profits, a portion of your profits, and pay it out as for social responsibility. That's part of FARD. You must do this, and even these businessmen compete for who's more generous, who's giving more. They get awards for it. I mean, the whole thing is just, the irony of how it's so built on the power of money is, you have to sit back and just think this is an extraordinary model, but they believe in it, and they believe they are changing the very nature of society through the economy.
Wow, that is really, really intriguing. Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in on this question?
Since Patricia provided such a broader analysis of it, I'll just focus on Hajj. And Hajj is a business. It functions as a business. However, it is very sensitive to public opinion, and Russian authoritarian standards sometimes don't apply to Hajj, to pilgrims, and authorities are highly flexible to pilgrims' protests. There have been a number of instances with pilgrims questioned authorities publicly in regions, and regional officials always try to react, to negotiate. And also Hajj operators are highly sensitive to reputational aspect of business, because this is like business interaction. If you are a pilgrim, you choose your operator. And if somebody doesn't have good reputation, you don't choose him, because this is considered once lifetime act, a really important one. And several operators lost their business after being accused in corruption. And when we say corruption, it is sometimes just making profit, because making profit in this business is considered as corruption. So this Muslim Islamic principles like highly regulate business and politics around Hajj in Russia.
Thank you. Any final comments from our panelists before we have to wrap up our session today? Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone, all the panelists, for your insights, your fascinating research and papers. It's been a great afternoon to spend with all of you. And I want to thank the co-organizers of this event, Indiana University's Russian and East European Institute, the Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center, and the Asian Studies Center as well, East Asian Center, Studies Center, excuse me. And as Professor Brosi put in the chat, everyone who registered for and attended our session today can expect to get a survey. That's really important for us that you please respond to that so that we can show our Department of Education funders all the wonderful things that we're doing with our grant money. And again, thanks to all of you for a really enlightening afternoon, and we look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.